All right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. And I apologize for the weather last week. I did put a request into NOAA for some good, nice weather last Wednesday, and we didn't get it. And today, on all honesty, is sort of a different kind of miserable today, rainy and a little sleety, slushy outside. So, but I'm happy you're joining us here tonight. Um, and um, and for your interest in the management of our public lands, of your public lands. There's a couple of things I want to touch on right up front. And the first one is you probably saw a little thing pop up on the screen a moment ago. We are recording this meeting. We've had some requests from folks who were unable to attend last week and unfortunately unable to attend tonight. So we're going to record it and it will be posted on our project website for your viewing pleasure. I also just want to clarify a couple of things up front related to the project itself. I emphasized these at the open house last week. One is that, there is no proposal for the management of any old growth forest in this project. And in addition to that, there is no proposal to harvest in anything that the state has designated as old forest. So I want to put that right out there because that seems to be one of the points that people are commenting on. And the other is that at this point in time, there isn't a preferred alternative. All of the four alternatives out there are being equally considered. So comments related to any of them are well received at this time. I also want to thank you all if you've participated in this project in earlier stages, whether it was on a field trip, one of our previous public meetings, at the scoping meeting, or you commented on it. We used all that information in the formulation of the project and in the alternatives that we've developed as part of the preliminary environmental assessment. So we really appreciate your previous participation. And that it resulted in some changes and additions of alternatives in the preliminary environmental assessment. So in the modified proposed action, alternative B, that is really just the proposed actions with some adjustments to it based on comments that we received and things that we noticed internally as well. So just some example, we clarified a couple of things that folks were not quite clear on what we were saying or proposing. We made some changes based on comments we received. So I'll use the Darning Needle snowmobile trail as my example there. We had proposed to decommission that trail, and based on comments and some further investigation on our part, we've now dropped that as an action. So we'll be maintaining the Darning Needle Trail. We also mistakenly left out a couple of items from the scoping notice. So we've corrected that in the preliminary environmental assessment. And most significantly, we're providing a more accurate depiction of the harvest acres compared to the stand acres, the actual acres that we're going to harvest. So those acres are in alternative B, the modified proposed action, 8,502. It's about 23% of the project area. What that results in an actual reduction in harvest that was originally proposed is only about 40 acres. And that 40 acres is related to remapping of some stands where we had accidentally overlapped into state designated old forest, and we adjusted our boundaries so that we're outside of those areas. We also came up with two additional action alternatives, alternative C and alternative D. And just a quick summary of those two. Alternative C was developed in response to comments that we received about the amount of mature and old forest that was proposed for harvest. So in that alternative, if you haven't read the document yet, there's about 660 acres dropped due to what we feel are some advanced late successional characteristics. So we've deferred the treatment of those that are no longer being considered. We also have some late successional enhancement activities that we're planning on about 3,600 acres of forest. Some of that is non-commercial treatments where we'd go in and recreate some standing dead and downed trees and some crown release to allow trees to better grow. And then there are some actual enhancement treatments on about 3,100 acres. And those treatments are aimed at enhancing late successional character where it exists and developing where it's absent. And then we have 2,242 acres of other timber harvest, kind of traditional timber harvest, which was originally proposed and is still in an alternative C. Alternative D includes all of those late successional enhancement things that I just mentioned. And in addition, we've reduced the skid distances by about 25% compared to alternative C. So that's reduced the acreage of harvest in that alternative from the modified proposed action in alternative B. And despite what you might be hearing or reading out there, we have been hard at work crafting and kind of shaping the modified proposed action and the two action alternatives. And they have significant differences from the original proposed action, especially alternatives C and D are significantly different in what we're proposing. And with that, I would like to take a moment and just thank both the Forest Service professionals and those outside the Forest Service who we consulted with and communicated with about the project, who helped us kind of craft those two action alternatives, alternative C and D. They are professionals, they are highly skilled and highly thought of in their fields, and we very much appreciate both the Forest Service folks and the externals who helped us along this path. And then Jay, who you see on the screen here, he's taken 15 or more people's separate writing styles and consolidated it into a single document, which is, you would think, was written by an individual person. He has spent timeless hours working on the document, collecting information, and then answering questions as it's come in from the public. So my greatest appreciation and gratitude to Jay for all his hard work. And lastly, I have a request for you all, and that is, when you provide us your comments, you do so from a place of knowledge, of your personal knowledge, that you have taken the time to read the preliminary environmental assessment, to read the effects analyses sections, look at the appendices, look at the map, look at the story map that's online that Jay's going to talk about in a minute, and use that information to craft and provide us your comments. Don't rely on what you think might be in the document or what someone else is telling you. We're proposing comment from that place of knowledge where you have firsthand knowledge of what's in that document. So that's really where I'm going to end tonight. But before we dive into what Jay is going to talk about a little bit more, I do want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. And that one of the things is what we're here for tonight, and what we're maybe not here for tonight. So we're here to respond to any questions that you may have that might provide a clarification about what we're proposing in any of the alternatives in the preliminary environmental assessment, and to provide some clarity on how you would go about providing comment on it. And Jay's going to spend a little bit of time talking about, like, what is a meaningful comment, what is a good comment that you can provide, how to structure your comment. We're not here to receive public comments. We're not going to be anything that you ask us. We're not writing it down. It'll be recorded, but it's not going to be considered in the comment record unless you provide it to us through one of the mechanisms that Jay is going to talk about in a moment. You might have realized that the chat and the reaction functions are turned off tonight. We've learned, and the Forest Service, I think, has learned, is they can be very distracting in a presentation like this, not only to the presenters, but some of the folks trying to watch what's going on. So we've turned those functions off tonight, so there's no chat available. Once Jay is finished, we will enter a question and answer phase. And to ask a question, just go ahead and raise your hand, and our moderator extraordinaire, Brianna Graham, will be keeping track of the hands as they go up, and she'll be able to call on you, turn your mic on, turn your camera on, so you can ask us your question in your own voice. And I think that's really important, that we hear it in your own voice, because there may be some nuance that even if the chat function was on, that nuance would be lost in the chat, and we might not quite get it. So you're able to, like, verbally ask us your question, and we'll do our best to answer it. If we can't answer your question, because we don't have our full suite of resource specialists here tonight, we will ask you to send that question along to Jay in an email, and we'll track down the answer to that question. We'll send it back to you, And we'll also collect them all and post them on the project website. So even if you didn't answer that question, you'll be able to see the answer to it by going to our project website. And then lastly, I just asked that we're all respectful tonight. And it's not only respectful to the folks that are presenting, but it's respectful to each other who are here and trying to listen in. We have a limited amount of time here tonight. We want to answer as many questions as we can possibly answer tonight, but realize that there may be others that want to ask a question. So there's this concept of share the air, right? Give someone else a chance to ask a question. If you've asked a couple already, maybe wait till the end to get a third question in or a fourth question in. And then we will be ending at right about 8 o'clock, right? 8 o'clock sharp. We won't cut somebody off mid-sentence, but we won't go on past 8 o'clock with more questions. You can always, if we don't get to your question, you can always send us a message and we'll respond to you as quickly as we can. So with that, thanks for being here tonight again, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jay.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. Again, my name is Jay Strand. I'm the Green Mountain and Finger Lakes National Forests forest planner and the environmental coordinator, and also the project leader for the Telephone Gap project. And what I'll be doing is just going over a quick presentation to reorient everyone to the project and go over a little bit of what's in the environmental analysis, the assessment itself, some other supporting documentation, and then maybe most importantly, just to go over how to submit comments just to make sure that you understand, how you can do that. But before I start, I do want to just remind everybody what the purpose of our meeting here is tonight. This is exactly what we did last Wednesday at the in-person meeting at Barstow Elementary School in Chittenden. It's really for you all to ask questions and seek clarification about anything that you're reading in the environmental assessment, the preliminary environmental assessment that we released for your review on March 8th, so that you can fully understand what's in that analysis as a basis for you to provide any meaningful comments, written comments that you choose to do so. You don't have to submit comments, but if you choose to submit comments, it's really important, like Chris said, to understand what's in there by reading these documents yourself. And to do so by the end of the 30-day comment period, which ends on April 8th, which is a Monday, 2024. So just to reorient everybody on where the Telephone Gap project is, or if this is the first time that you've actually listened in on any of our meetings or discussions regarding this project, the project area is all on the Rochester and Middlebury Ranger districts on the Green Mountain National Forest, located in the south central western part of the state. I was going to see, can everybody see my cursor on there? Yes, no? Oh, good.
Yep, we can see it, Jay.
Perfect. So yeah, here's Chittenden Reservoir right here in the middle, just to give you a little perspective on the project area as a whole. And right here, the southern boundary is US Highway 4. And Vermont 100 is basically on the eastern side of the project area. So Rutland is down here and Killington Mountain Ski Area is right here, just to give you a really good idea on where this project area is even located. It's over 72,000 acres total in size, but it's really important to realize that just shy of half of that is actual national forest lands. So anything that is colored within the project area boundary is national forest lands. All of the proposed activities and all of the action alternatives are on national forest lands, aside from some of the proposed temporary roads, which may cross private land in some locations, but everything else is on National Forest System lands. About 44% is privately owned. That's basically all the white area within the project area, with a smattering of some town and state lands, about 7%. There's 3 primary management areas, and what I mean by primary, they make up most of the project area, about 76% of the total project area. And management areas are described in our land and resource management plan, and we refer to that as our forest plan. And each management area has its own special emphasis on what the desired condition is within those management areas, and some of the specific direction on what we can and can't do within those parts of the national forest which have been allocated to those management areas. So the diverse backcountry, remote wildlife habitat, and diverse forest use are all management areas where we are able to actively manage national forest system lands, including harvesting timber for various and sundry resource reasons, which we'll get into here shortly. But I just wanted to emphasize those are the three management areas where the predominance of all our management activities are proposed. There's some visual enhancement treatments along the Long Trail management area corridor, but most are within those three management areas. And just to give you a little idea of the differences of the emphasis on some of what we can and can't do in there, like I mentioned, we are able to propose timber harvest treatments within all management areas, but the diverse forest use management area, which is the light green on the map, that allows the most flexibility on opportunity for management activities that we can propose compared to diverse backcountry or remote wildlife habitat. And an example of a difference is that for diverse forest use, we're able to harvest areas for even age regeneration treatments up to, we call them temporary openings, up to 30 acres. For remote wildlife habitat in the diverse backcountry management areas, it's limited to 20 acres, just for example. There's many other differences, but I just wanted to go over, just one or two, just so you would understand. You'd have to go to the land management plan to see the differences between all of them in detail. So I also want to just reorient everybody and remind everybody what the National Environmental Policy Act requires us to do as a federal agency. We refer to this act as NEPA, and it really has a dual purpose, primarily to disclose environmental effects, consider them and disclose them of all of our management activities that are occurring on federal lands, the national forest. And the other is to inform you, the public, of what those effects are, and get your involvement, seek your input, which is exactly what we're doing tonight. And also to provide Chris as the responsible official as a basis for deciding what to do. So all those things together basically is what we're required of the requirements of NEPA in a nutshell. I just want to go over really quickly what's happened since the Telephone Gap project was formally proposed back in January of 2023. It's hard to believe that was 14 months ago, over a year ago when we did that, but a lot has happened since then. First of all, we received over 1,600 comments, individual comments from people who responded to our proposed action during the 45-day comment period. We read over all of those comments in detail and considered them and determined and derived what we call issues of concern. Issues of concern simply are us looking at comments and determining what part of the proposed activity that you were concerned about in the comment and the effect on the landscape of some resource, which was the source of your concern in the first place. So we call that the cause and effect relationship. We try to put that into an issue statement so we can have a clear distinction of what the concern is. And then we categorize those into resources based on like type resources that those issues of concern were related to. And that gave us a really good feel for how to move forward in our environmental analysis. There's two ways that we use issues of concern or public comments in the environmental analysis process. The first is for determining which issues would warrant a development of an alternative to the proposed action to include for detailed analysis in the environmental assessment. And the other reason that we use those, or the purpose the way we use those comments and issues of concern, is to really focus the environmental analysis on the resources that are most meaningful to you, the people who actually rose those concerns in the first place. Those are the primary uses of comments and your public involvement through the NEPA process. Then we took those issues of concern, as I said, categorized them into resources, and then we disclosed effects associated with those resources from the proposed action. And alternatives that we've included for detailed analysis. So there's 4 alternatives included in the environmental assessment. A no action alternative and 3 action alternatives. Chris talked about those in his introductory comments, and I'll go into them in a little bit more detail coming up in a few slides. It's important to note that all proposed activities and all of the action alternatives comply with forest plan direction. And what I mean by that are the goals, the objectives, the desired conditions, and the standards and guidelines, both forest-wide standards and guidelines and those that are specific to the management areas within the project area. Everything we've designed in those proposed activities comply with that direction. It's really important to realize that, because that's not really repeated anywhere in the environmental assessment. That's just something that's a given, and I'm just letting you all know that. So let's talk about those alternatives, because to me, the alternatives really is the heart and soul of a NEPA document. In fact, the older NEPA implementing regulations that were replaced in 2020, regulations before that actually had those words in the regulations, that the alternatives in a NEPA document are the heart of the NEPA document. And the reason why that is because if an alternative is developed and included for detailed analysis, it's addressing an issue of concern that is at such a high level of concern that we felt like it needed an alternative approach to meet the purpose of the project while we're addressing that concern, both at the same time. And when you take an alternative that's been developed to address that issue and look at the effects for that alternative and compare it to the effects to the proposed action, you can see a clear trade-off of the effects associated with both alternatives. And that's true for any alternative that's been included for detailed analysis. So it allows you, the public, to understand what the environmental effect trade-offs are between alternatives. And for Chris as the responsible official, when he gets to a place where he needs to choose one of those alternatives for implementation. And that's why it's the heart and soul and the most important concept of the NEPA process to me, to convey to you tonight. So you will see that the alternatives that we've developed, well, the no action alternative is a given. That's a requirement of NEPA, that we would include an alternative as if none of the activities that we're proposing would take place, just ongoing activities that have already been approved, routine maintenance, road maintenance, trail maintenance, a few other things that are covered by other environmental document NEPA decisions that have been made in the past. Those will continue, but nothing we're proposing in any of the action alternatives would take place. And that serves as a baseline to compare our action alternatives to. And as Chris had mentioned and discussed at the beginning, our alternative B simply is a modification of our proposed action. And they're reflecting changes suggested by you, the public, during the public commenting process back in January of 2023, and our own agency staff review. And he mentioned a few examples of what those differences are. And there's a list of highlighted changes in the actual environmental assessment at the beginning of Chapter 2 in Section 2.2. If you want to write that down, and you can go right to that section and see a list that highlights these changes that modified the original proposal. And that brings us to the alternative that we've developed to address concerns with harvesting mature and old forests, including the impacts to their carbon storage capacity. This, I would say, by far was probably the most repeated concern that we received from the comments that we got back in January of 2023 out of those 1,600 responses. It is an issue that we felt warranted an alternative in the way that it has been addressed, as Chris had mentioned at the beginning, is that we dropped about 660 acres that are part of the alternative B proposed action from harvest. Those stands are showing characteristics of late forest late successional forest on the landscape, and late successional forest, according to our definition, and that's in the forest plan, is basically the phase of forest development that directly precedes an old growth forest phase of forest development on the landscape. So it's the last stage right before it morphs into actual old growth stands. We identified stands that have characteristics of late successional forest and dropped them from the alternative C. And we also identified, as Chris had mentioned, about 3,150 acres of stands that were proposed in alternative B, but they also are showing signs and some exhibiting some characteristics of late successional forest. And we've modified our silvicultural treatments to enhance those characteristics within those stands. There's actually 464 acres on top of that that we've identified that also have those types of characteristics, late successional forest characteristics, where we're not doing actual commercial harvest treatments, but non-commercial treatments to enhance the development of snags and crown development within those stands to enhance those types of late successional forest characteristics within those stands. So all those together are about 3,600 acres that are directly focused on enhancing the late successional conditions across the landscape. And then the remainder of alternative C are about 4,000 acres of silvicultural harvest treatments, the same that are described in alternative B, just a reduced amount. So overall, the reduced amount of actual harvest acres within alternative C is about 11% less than alternative B, just to give you an idea of the difference there. And then alternative D takes alternative C just a little bit further. And the reason it was developed and included for detailed analysis in the environmental assessment is to address concerns with fossil fuel carbon emissions from harvest activities. So in other words, skidders and chainsaws even, and heavy equipment that's used to harvest timber combust fossil fuels and emit carbon into the atmosphere. That was an issue that came out of public comments as well. And we wanted to develop an alternative and include it for analysis in the environmental assessment to reduce those emissions. And so this alternative D has the exact same late successional forest conditions, those enhancement treatments, the exact same types of treatments, the exact same acres, but it reduces the other harvest treatments as described in alternative B that are included in alternative C, and it reduces them in alternative D. So overall reductions in the harvest as a result of alternative D to reduce the skidding distances and the amount of heavy equipment that's needed to harvest that timber to reduce the emissions from fossil fuel combustion is about 34% compared to alternative B. So alternative C reduces it by 11%, the amount of harvest treatment areas, and alternative D reduces it further to 34%. The other side of the reasons that I mentioned to you that we use those issues of concerns that are derived from public comments is to drive the focus of the environmental analysis itself, to include effects for resources that are most meaningful to you, the public. We have included in the environmental assessment, and this would be in chapter 3 of the environmental assessment itself, to include the effects associated with forest habitat. And that would include the forest type composition and age class distributions. What would happen to those two features as a result of the action alternatives as well as the no action alternative. And it includes a discussion of effects related to the mature and old forest resource within the project area, as well as wildlife habitat, associated wildlife habitat. We've also included effects associated with forest health, including insects and disease and invasive plants. And we've included a section to talk about effects related to carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. including the sequestration, storage, and carbon emissions associated with biogenic and fossil fuel sources. And biogenic sources are simply organically derived sources of carbon, such as harvesting trees or the result of prescribed burning, the smoke that's emitted into the atmosphere. That's a biogenic source. Fossil fuel sources, as I mentioned, not only include the combustion of fossil fuels to drive equipment to actually implement harvest activities within the project area, but all other activities as well. The chainsaws or the equipment that's used to construct trails, to maintain roads, to construct some of those parking lots that we propose, all of that is included in the environmental effects section that's named carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. And I want to highlight here to you now that this environmental assessment is the first environmental assessment agency-wide for the Forest Service that has disclosed quantitatively the carbon emissions directly and indirectly resulting from harvesting trees at the project-specific level. It is the first environmental assessment to do that. And it also includes emissions from fossil fuels together in that same section. You will note that the two resources here highlighted in white probably are going to have the most detail of effects in the environmental assessment compared to all the other sections. Not probably, they will, because they are the most exhaustive as far as detail compared to the other resources that we've included, simply because those are the two important issues that drove alternatives. And so that is the reason why there's more detail. But there's other sections that go into a good amount of level detail as well, disclosing effects associated with threatened, endangered, and sensitive species. That's both wildlife and plants. We've included effects associated with water, wetlands, fisheries, soil, and air quality. We've included effects specific to recreation, visuals, in the roadless area concern. There is a roadless area within the project area called the Pittenden Roadless Area. And it was part of the inventory roadless evaluation process during forest plan revision. And we've disclosed effects associated with the roadless character from proposed activities for all action alternatives and the no action alternative for that area. And last but not least, we've included effects associated with heritage and socioeconomics. All of these resources together are Chapter 3 of the environmental assessment. They all were derived from issues of concern from public comments. Every single one of these resources was brought up to some level of degree of concern from public comments. And so that's why they are included in the environmental assessment. So you may be asking yourself, where do I even start, if I haven't yet, to figure out how I would even begin to think about submitting comments to us in writing. Of course, you need to look at that preliminary environmental assessment that's dated February 2024, issued on March 8th, 2024. And you definitely need to look at that document and read it for yourself on what's in there to base your comments. But also look at the no less than 7 project maps that go with that environmental assessment that shows the locations of all the proposed activities for each of the action alternatives. There's also an appendices associated with the environmental assessment. It includes design features and mitigation measures right up front, Appendix A and B. And in a nutshell, those two features, design features and mitigation measures, together with forest plan standards and guidelines, provide the protective measures that we are requiring to be included and incorporated into the actual implementation of the action alternatives to protect resources from, I should say, mitigating or limiting the effects to those resources below levels of threshold of concern. And so that's why those are included in the appendices, the design features and the mitigation measures, together with the forest plan standards and guidelines. There's also a modified proposed action detailed version that you need to be aware of. The the environmental assessment only summarizes the modified proposed action. To get the full details look at the detailed version of that modified proposed action. And we tried to show in red font, in italicized, and bolded all the places where the proposed action was changed from the proposal from January of 2023 to make it easier for you to discern what it's actually changed since January 2023. There's a lot of supporting information to help you navigate the environmental assessment, to give you a little bit more context, what's behind it and what's in that document. The consideration of comments document simply lists all of the issues boiled down to issue statements that came out of public comments. And this document shows how those issues of concern were addressed in the environmental assessment, where they were addressed, and if they were not addressed in the environmental assessment, why they were not addressed there. So it's a good document to see how your comments were addressed, considered, and addressed, because we feel like it's if you took the time to submit comments to us, then you deserve to see how we address them in the environmental assessment, or why we didn't address them in the environmental assessment. There's also a document that's very similar called the Alternatives Considered, but not included for detailed analysis. And that lists a lot of very specific suggestions to change or modify the proposed action or to improve it, and also suggestions and requests for alternatives to the proposed action to address concerns. We listed all of them, and we provided how they were either incorporated into alternatives A, B, C, or D, and if they were not, why they were not. So you can go there and look and see as well how maybe your comment was addressed in the environmental assessment. Those two documents together are very important for you to understand how we address comments. Whoops. The carbon analysis methodology and the forest carbon assessment are also good sources for you to have a better context of what went into the carbon analysis in the environmental assessment. And then there's also biological evaluations for both wildlife and plant threatened and endangered species. There's no threatened and endangered plant species, just sensitive species on the Green Mountain National Forest, but those are also available for your review. All of these documents are available on our website. And that's where we encourage you to go to see where these documents are and read for yourself and review them, what's in them, and base your comments on what's there. We realize that there's limitations for some of you to be able to access documents on the internet. You might have dicey internet connection where you live, or maybe no internet at all. And so what we've done is that we've delivered hard copy versions of all of these documents, all of the main documents, the environmental assessment, the appendices, and the maps, at 3 town offices, Chittenden, Mendon, and Pittsfield, and also at our Rochester Ranger Station office in Rochester, and our Mendon headquarters on US Highway 4 in Mendon. So you can drop in there and review those documents there, recognizing that you may not be able to access them online. We wish we would be able to provide you hard copies per request, but we simply were not able to do that given the limitations of our capacity and the volume, the sheer level and volume of some of these documents just prohibit that for us to be able to do that. So if you do choose to go to any of these offices, the town offices or our own Forest Service offices to review those documents, please call ahead of time just to make sure that those offices are open, because we'd hate for you to make that trip and realize then that the office might have been closed or not available for you to do so. So there's also, I just want to point out online, there's a story map. It provides a visual display of the action alternatives described in the preliminary EA. It's a great tool to get a visual perspective of what we're proposing. And I would really encourage you to take a look at that. That's also available online. And I'm going to shift a bit here and now talk about how to submit comments, just so there's no misunderstanding on the proper manner for you to do so, for us to be able to consider them as we move on to the next phase of the project analysis, which I'll get into here in a few slides. But on page 2 of the cover letter that we distributed by email on March 8th to a lot of you, but if you didn't get that email notification, the cover letter is on our project website, And on page 2 of that letter, it very clearly states the ways that you can submit written comments. We highly encourage you to use our online commenting system, and I'll show you on the next slide how you can do that. But the reason why we encourage you to do that, for us, this is the easiest way for us to read your comments and to sort them out and to be able to discern what your concerns are compared to the other means that are available for you to submit written comments. So we would prefer you to do it this way. And also a great feature of it is that if you provide these comments online through this online system, your comments are available to others to review in our reading room online. And you can go in there and read everybody else's comments as well. Nobody's private individual information is included in that reading room, or any of the comments that you submit online will be available publicly. They will be part of our project record, but nobody's going to be able to see your address or your phone number or your email address. They'll only see your name associated with the comment. And I want to point out, they won't show up unless you include them into the context or text of your actual comment letter. So if you don't want your private information to be seen, don't include it in the actual comment itself. And I'll show you how to do that here in a second. But if you can't use the online system for whatever reason, we also will accept your comments by good old-fashioned snail mail, by fax. We still have a fax machine in our Rochester office, so you can submit them that way, or you can even hand deliver them during business hours. And again, please call just to make sure that the office is open, but we're normally open between 8 and 4:30 Monday through Friday, not including federal holidays. It's very important for you to be able to understand that written comments need to be submitted by the 30th day of the comment period, which is in this case April 8th. So just shy of midnight on April 8th is the deadline for your comments to be considered for objection eligibility. It doesn't mean that a comment submitted after that, we wouldn't consider it. We still can read it. We still can consider it. It just doesn't give you or afford you the ability to object to the project during the objection phase of the project, which I will talk about here in a few slides. So submitting comments online is a fairly easy process. If you go to our project website, which is also in that cover letter that I mentioned to you that was sent to everybody, which is also available online, although you wouldn't be able to get to it online if you didn't have the project website address. Even if you just Google Green Mountain National Forest and navigate to the project website, you can get to it that way for the Telephone Gap project. But once you get there, you'll get to this page, and on the right-hand panel menu, you'll see Get Connected. And the second link down says comment or object on a project. We're in the comment phase, so that you can just ignore the objection part of that link, but you click on there and it'll bring you to this page right here. It's the commenting page, and up will pop up these boxes that you can type your personal information in here, your name and your address, phone number, email address. And it's really, I think, important to include your email address so that we can communicate with you and notify you of upcoming information regarding this project. It's how a lot of you receive notification for the review of the preliminary EA in the first place, as well as the in-person and virtual public meeting. So if you can include that, I would really encourage you to do so. But down here in this box is where you can actually type in your comment, or you can simply attach a file, a Word document or a PDF by just pressing here, choose file, and just navigate it that way, and it'll show up as an attachment in the commenting system. But to emphasize and to reiterate, all this personal information up here you submit will not be made public. It will not be on our website. It will not be in the reading room. It will only show up in our project record, which is not available. That part would not be available for public review. So I just want to go over really quickly what we mean by meaningful comments. So first of all, any comment you submit is meaningful. I don't mean to say that any comments that come in aren't meaningful. All the comments that you submit will be meaningful, but there are more meaningful comments than others. And what I mean by that is that a meaningful comment for us are comments that will really be more easy for us to discern or be able to identify concerns or needed additional analysis in the final environmental assessment, which is why we're asking for your comments now. And so try to be as specific as possible. When you're general, it's a bit difficult to get exactly what it is your concern is. So the more specific, the better. It has to have a direct relationship with any of the proposed activities for any of the action alternatives. So if there's no relationship to anything that we're proposing in any of those action alternatives, there's nothing that we can do to address it in this environmental assessment. So keep it specific to those activities. Have to have a direct relationship to them. An important, meaningful comment is one that identifies perceived gaps in our analysis. We know that people will disagree with some of our conclusions. We're interested in hearing about that. We're also interested if we miss something altogether, completely. Those are the things I'm talking about by perceived gaps. Providing supporting rationale for Chris to consider when he's making his decision. What's the rationale for your concern? Provide some sort of substantive rationale why that is a concern to you. It really helps us on our end to try and figure out how to address it. This last one is not required, including your name and contact information. You can submit comments anonymously. You don't even have to put your name on it at all. But if you don't, it will not be considered a comment that will provide you eligibility to object. Anonymous comments do not provide you eligibility to object when we get to that phase of the project. And I'll talk about that here on this slide. Where do we go from here? So after we go through all the comments that we receive, after the comment period is over, we're going to consider any needed additional analysis to complete the final environmental assessment. Together with a draft decision notice and finding of no significant impact, we're hoping by the end of June 2024. That's our current timeline. We did not include a draft decision notice or a finding of no significant impact at this phase of the project because it would be premature to do so. There may be additional information that Chris may need to know before he can make that determination. So he will not make that determination until we get a final environmental assessment. It is entirely possible that somewhere along the line between now and then, an effect rises some level of concern that would be determined or could be potentially significant. If that happens, it automatically triggers an environmental impact statement. But up until now, Chris has not seen anything that would flag that sort of situation. When the final environmental assessment and draft decision notices are ready, they will be released for your review, public review, and that will initiate a 45-day administrative review objection period. In order for anybody to be eligible to object, must have submitted a written comment during one of the formal opportunities to comment. That includes the 45-day comment period back in January 2023 and the one that we're currently in. The only other way that you would have eligibility if you didn't comment during one of those comment periods is if something comes up between the preliminary EA and the final EA that's entirely new information, and you were able to object on that information only. So those are the only ways that you would have eligibility to object. And that's why it's important for you to understand, in order to have eligibility, you need to include your name and contact information, and to submit them by midnight or 11:59 p.m., I guess I should say, on April 8th, if you didn't submit comments during the January 2023 45-day comment period. The final decision notice can then be completed by Chris. He'll select one of the alternatives in that decision notice together with a tentatively a finding of no significant impact, depending on the outcome of the objections. It could be late summer or early fall. There's a 45-day objection review period conducted by an independent group of Forest Service staff outside of the Green Mountain National Forest organization who will look at those objection issues and provide their perspective on how well we did not address the objection issue in the environmental analysis. There may be instructions from that review team to Chris to fix in the final environmental assessment before he can sign off on a final decision. Once that takes place, we would be in a position to implement any part of that project, whatever alternative he selects, by as early as late 2024 or into 2025. And so that brings me to the end of the presentation. The rest of this presentation is for you to ask questions. Hopefully we can answer as many as we can. And with that, I will stop sharing.
We will take questions now. For anybody who is new to Teams, at the top of your Teams window is a toolbar with a raise hand function. If you click the raise button, your hand will raise, and then if you click it again, your hand will come down. I will call on you as I see hands raised and unmute your mics. Drew? I think I've unmuted your mic, but you may need to unmute your mic as well, Drew.
Drew, right next to that camera icon at the top near, there you go.
Found it. Hey, sorry about that. Drew Hudson from Rochester, Vermont. Just a quick question about the story map in particular for the project. I'm looking at a substantial difference in the successional enhancement harvests description between alternatives B, C, and D, and it's just called additional timber harvest. Alternative B shows almost none of that. Alternative C and D show substantial additional timber harvest, but it's different, but I don't know how, from things like group selection or individual tree selection. Can you explain the difference between additional timber harvest and the other kinds of timber harvesting and the additional alternatives?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Drew. So what we mean by additional harvest treatments and alternative C and D are the harvest treatments that are similar in description to what we're proposing in alternative B. So in other words, when we say additional, it's in addition to those late successional forest enhancement treatments that we talked about, which are really the primary difference in those alternatives C and D that we've come up with those enhancement treatments. So the additional harvest treatments for C and D are just the, I'm going to call it traditional silvicultural treatments or methods that are described in alternative B, just a reduced amount of them. Did that make sense?
He's probably muted again. The description of those treatments you can look at in the environmental assessment, Drew. You'll find them. They're spelled out into how many acres they are and exactly what treatments they are.
Thanks. Yes, that answers the question.
Douglas?
Now, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, I've got several questions, but I'll say the first one though is concerning improvements in the forest. You know, like you mentioned trails and culverts and bridges and that kind of thing. Is the money set aside before the project starts for those things? And if it is, does that guarantee installation of all those practices?
Yeah, so it works in multiple ways, Doug. In some cases, we're approving things for the future. Meaning that we realize that we have some culverts that need to be installed and some road improvements that need to be made and some trail improvements that need to be made, because that's what our landscape assessment, the original document in this process, that's what everybody did. They went out and looked like, what do we need to do to push this area towards the desired future condition in the forest plan? So in some cases, they're just projects, they don't have funding yet. And once they get approved, if they get approved, they're what we call shelf stock. They'll sit until such time as we get appropriated dollars to be able to implement them.
So
Other-
it could be some time before a culvert, which could be a problem for migration of aquatic species. It could be now or never that gets done. Is that right?
I wouldn't say it would be never. We have a pretty good track record of getting things that we approve in these integrated resource projects completed. But yeah, for example, those two aquatic organism passage projects on Forest Road 57, they wouldn't be immediately implemented the following year. We would have to submit those as a funding request, because those are so expensive. We'd have to submit those as a funding request, but we also have a very good track record of getting them funded.
Does that come out of the timber harvest funds then?
It sometimes can. It depends on what type of timber harvest contract is used with a particular purchaser. And there are other projects, or it might not even be the timber purchaser. It might be a partner who seeks out that funding, like someone like Trout Unlimited, who would, help us look for funding to implement that on the landscape.
Okay. Thank you.
Eric? Eric, I've unmuted your mic on my end. If you want to unmute your mic on your end, you should be able to ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to know the date of the forest plan that the Green Mountain Forest is working from at this point. When was that promulgated?
The current forest plan was revised in 2006, Eric.
Is it a little long in the tooth relative to NEPA?
The planning regulations call for revision every 10 to 15 years. So doing the math, we are past the 15-year time period. But revisions, forest plans nationally for all national forests is subject to available funding. And available funding right now is being allocated to forest plans, and mainly out in the western part of the United States, who are operating under 30-year plus old forest plans. So we're basically in a queue waiting for available funding to revise our forest plan.
Okay.
Monica, if you want to unmute your mic.
Hi, yeah, I had a question, and just on that, two things just to add on to that. Wondering if this isn't a question, just a comment, but wondering if it would make sense to not take any action in the forest until we were able to acquire funding to revise the forest plan. But don't need to respond to that. My question is, I appreciate the fact that 661 acres are potentially in one of the alternatives being removed because they're late successional or old growth. But I was curious, what about the other areas? And, what's the cutoff? Like how in the other areas that are being cut, how many years away are those areas from becoming late successional or old growth?
That's a James question, I think.
Yeah, I think I can help answer that. So thanks, Monica. It's a difficult thing to pinpoint when a stand transitions from just being mature to being old growth. And I think we've attempted many times now to define those different successional stages with characteristics that can be measured on the ground. And so for this project, we have forest plan definitions of mature, which is purely age-based. And then we have a forest plan definition of old growth, which includes a little bit more kind of nuance about disturbance history and size and characteristics. And in reality, what kind of moves a stand from being mature to old growth is this complexity that happens through kind of random events. It doesn't just happen when a stand reaches a certain age, right? It takes time for a wind event to kill a large diameter tree that then creates a snag that also creates a gap in the canopy for new trees to become established in and grow up. So there's no real way that we can say with any certainty how long it takes for those areas of mature forest to become old growth. But when we developed these alternatives, we were working with kind of our best ways to quantify what could be a late successional forest. And we looked at the abundance of large diameter trees. We looked at the diversity of tree sizes to kind of tell us if we have large diameter trees, that's really kind of an indicator of mature forest. But if you have this spectrum of large diameter trees and small diameter trees, that gives you an idea that there's been openings in the canopy that established kind of new ages of trees over time. So that could be a multi-age forest, right? An indicator of old growth. And then we looked at the abundance of snags, right? These dead trees, because some of our species are very long-lived. It takes time for them to actually die and become a snag. So I don't know if that quite answers it, but we to develop that alternative, we kind of established a threshold for what we would consider a late successional forest, and we worked with a couple commenters through Vermont Audubon and Vermont Natural Resources. Help me with their name, Jay.
Vermont Natural Resource Council.
Yep. As well as Bill Keaton at University of Vermont to establish that threshold for what should be considered that late successional forest. And then we worked with them to kind of figure out, well, what stands are on the cusp, should be on the cusp of developing those conditions that we want to move again into that more late successional forest over time. And so those thresholds that we used for our definitions were really much lower than the experts thought they needed to be. If that makes any sense, like we were trying to take stands that maybe aren't really that close to being old growth in a lot of ways, but because of the overwhelming kind of public desire for that, as well as this interest from these groups to move more of the forest towards that old growth condition, we lowered that threshold into more just pure mature forest that maybe has some of those elements, but not quite at that threshold yet. And those are the stands that we're going to be enhancing those late successional attributes over time to create more multi-age, multi-storied conditions to develop larger diameter trees. But if you want an idea of those exact thresholds, there's a document that I'll point to on our project website that actually describes in detail, you know, how many big trees break, or, you know, what threshold of snags, et cetera. Does that answer your question, Monica?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Douglas, you can unmute your mic and ask a question.
There. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Mine's kind of a specific question about practices that go on during these various cuts. And the one particular issue is the riparian zones. We've had a lot of flooding in Vermont. Of course, it's, you know, a major issue here. It should be, you know, colonially we developed in the floodplains because that was the canoe routes and stuff in and out of the villages and stuff that we created. But my question is going back to class 1 streams up in these forested areas that are going to be harvested. How wide of riparian zones, or no-touch zones, I would call them, are required by the loggers to stay the heck away from a blue line?
Do you want me to take that one again, Chris?
Yeah, go ahead, James. I was like looking for that answer, and without like
The
Jeremy or John
standards,
McCann here.
I know some federal agencies have developed standards. You know, research back in the day shows at least 100 feet of riparian width before, and I've seen some of these logging operations where that's rarely paid attention to, and sometimes, you know, they'll drive through the stream with their equipment and that kind of thing too. So I guess my question is, what kind of a standard does the Forest Service apply to these loggers that are going to be harvesting these things in regards to riparian zones?
Yeah, Douglas, so we have a forest plan standard that requires a minimum of a 25-foot no-cut buffer on either side of a perennial stream. That's a minimum. Sometimes we go beyond that. And I'll give you some examples. And some of that is, you know, because that's a minimum, some of it's at the discretion of those doing the layout to go beyond that for other reasons. You know, we have other provisions in the telephone gap project that talk about sensitive soil. So maybe there's an area that's beyond that. You know, for wetlands, it's 100 feet no cut buffer around a wetland. So often those are kind of linked closely with perennial streams. So those are the kind of the minimum standards. The cases where we go beyond that, I'll say if there are kind of clear operational reasons why we don't want equipment operating closer, I'll back off my layout beyond that. Or if it's a stream that, say, our biologist has identified for downwood enhancement, I'll back off usually a tree length, just because we're trying to increase the amount of wood in the stream. I'm not going to remove that future recruitment potential. Did that answer your question, Doug?
Yeah, I think so. It's 25 foot's the standard then. So if you went out, if I was out fishing on a stream and the guys were logging and they were inside 25 feet, I'd report it. Beyond 25 feet, they're in the within the standard of the Forest Service. Is that correct?
And they, you know, the Vermont acceptable management practices, you know, allow for crossings of those streams and kind of put in place measures to protect water quality that allow for that crossing. So you will see them, you know, potentially cross a perennial stream in
Where they lay logs
in
and drive over the logs. That
Correct.
Kind of thing.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So you have an inspector on site when they're out cutting, is that right?
Yeah, we have a timber sale administrator, a very dedicated timber sale administrator who is, makes multiple rounds a week of active operations, including spot checks on weekends and holidays. So again, very dedicated and very, I would say, concerned about the protection of the resource. And so, he's at that point though, there's multiple, I would say, links in the chain to ensure that we're meeting our forest plan standards. And so one of them is during our layout phase, that's primarily me, but then we bring that kind of plan back to the specialists who all, the soil scientists, hydrologists, and biologists, to show them, hey, this is what we did out there. Did we get it right? Did we follow all of your mitigation measures and design features? And they, again, have an opportunity to check it at that time. The timber sale administrator then carries that contract out, making sure that they're following all of the provisions in the environmental assessment and the forest plan and the Vermont acceptable management practices. And then we have follow-up monitoring that Jay actually facilitates to spot check a certain number of past harvested areas on both districts of the forest every year to make sure, hey, did we do what we said we were going to do out here?
Rick, you may unmute your mic and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I just have a couple of points I want to get clarified, and so I need to read a couple of statements from the environmental assessment. So the first is it's about regenerating forest habitat. So regenerating forest habitat is an important element of forest habitat diversity because it can provide quality early successional habitat conditions that are important for many species of wildlife. Then you give a few examples of that. And then say early successional characteristics change gradually over time up to 20 years, at which time their wildlife habitat benefits diminish. So just to clarify, are you saying basically that early successional habitats provide more wildlife habitat benefit than the forest habitat that succeeds to?
Hi, Rick. Thank you for your question. Early successional habitat provides different benefits, and for some species, a mosaic is required. Black bears is a good example. Our state biologists will tell you black bears need mature forest, early successional habitat, and wetlands as their key habitat features here in Vermont. So it's part of the story, part of the mosaic. Species like moose, moose can't eat any part of a mature tree, right? That seems ridiculous to suggest. What they're eating is the young shoots that are more palatable and digestible and have nutrients in them. So those species need those early successional components. The 20-year threshold is based on studies particularly of songbirds, where researchers have documented the diversity of avian species in these areas, and the diversity is much higher in these very early successional habitats as they're regenerating, and then the number of species present will start declining, and that 20 years is that tipping point of when we see those early successional dependent birds leaving and looking for younger patches.
Okay, just if I could, I'll pose a hypothetical, and whether you answer it or not, it's up to you. But I'm just kind of curious that if you were to change the wording in that sentence, that early successional characteristics change gradually over time up to 20 years, at which time their biodiversity benefits diminish. Would that be the same answer?
Yep, I think that would be a worthy edit.
Yeah, I was looking at that sentence, Rick. I'm realizing it could have been written a little bit more clearly. It's not like it's losing all of its wildlife benefits just because it's morphed past 20 years. It could be read that way. That's not what that means, though. It's more the benefits that it's providing for species that are dependent on that early successional habitat for some phase or cycle of their life dependency process. That's diminished, but it certainly is providing wildlife benefits for other species past that stage. And I think that's what needs to be clarified.
Okay, one more sentence. This is on page 11. And it's actually, this is this is said a couple of times in the assessment. It is important to balance the role forests have on countering carbon emissions through their carbon sequestration and storage capacity with the need to address declining forest health and lack of habitat diversity within the project area. So my question is, who says? That's not, that sentence is not, there's no citation given for that statement.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Rick. I'm looking at page 11 of you're looking at the environmental assessment or another document?
Maybe it was the proposal. I'm not sure. I'm going back and forth between the two.
You know, I get what you're saying, Rick. It's the statement is it's trying to what is trying to be conveyed there is the balance of our management approach to optimize carbon storage, carbon management, recognizing the importance of forests to capture carbon and store it in the forest ecosystem with the other resource benefits or needs or opportunities that are occurring within National Forest System lands, including the forest health, the health of the actual forests, including insects and diseases primarily. But as we get increased stressors from changing climate, the forests themselves will become under increasing stress. And so mortality resulting from those stresses, we were recognizing in that statement that actually can work against our management approach to optimize carbon storage, because as trees die, they decompose and release carbon into the atmosphere, just as trees are cut and release carbon into the atmosphere. So we're trying to balance optimizing carbon management with management of other resource benefits. And that's what that statement is trying to get at. There are references that we could cite, and I believe there are in the forest-wide carbon assessment that is on our website as supporting information. There's a whole section in there on carbon stewardship that references quite a few research literature that supports the statement.
Thank you.
Yep.
Elaine, you may unmute and ask your question.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, to categorize old growth forests, you seem to use on the ground standards such as tree height, tree diameter, right, etc. But these are standard practices implemented by the Forest Service / Department of Agriculture. But there are new non-Forest Service Department of Agriculture studies that use satellite and LiDAR studies. I have one here in front of me. It's by Della Sella, 2022. I happened to see one of his presentations. He puts forth like a relative forest structure map using LiDAR and Google Earth. He uses tree height, canopy cover, and biomass, and he comes up with a structural ranking This puts your section of Vermont and my section of New Hampshire, because I'm from New Hampshire, at a 5 on a scale of 0 to 9. And this is called almost mature. 6 would be categorized as mature. I mean, would you be willing to address more of these modern studies instead of going around, measuring tree heights and tree diameters to come up with old growth forest? There's got to be a better way than what you're using. That's it. I'm done. That's my question.
Suzanne, you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. And we may pull in James to answer some more of this, provide additional detail as well. We've got multiple definitions, I think, going on right now. And we have a forest plan definition that was part of the 2006 revision of the forest plan, and the EIS along with that, and all the associated public review and review that went through designated particular areas that we continue to track as truly old growth. As part of this entire ongoing process, the Green Mountain National Forest has worked closely with the state of Vermont to apply the state's definition of old forest and the critical mass of late successional attributes that comprise old forest from the state's fairly new definition. And that's been a collaborative process. We looked at potential areas and we field checked anything that was within or near adjacent to proposed vegetation treatments for these characteristics, and worked with the state to define those, draw those polygons of those areas. I lost my thought there. Yeah, so we have old forest. I think it's important to note that there were very few and very small areas of overlap. And these were areas that were mapped separately from the timber proposal. So timber folks and silviculturalists were looking for a particular set of conditions and opportunities for improvement on the ground, and ecologists and state folks were looking for these old forest attributes, and almost with very, very few exceptions, they did not overlap. We're seeing a lot of the similar attributes on the ground. In addition, we are looking at additional opportunities to continue surveying and field checking for these old forests and late successional attributes in these particularly special areas on the ground. The state is working on some modeling, and we've been involved tangentially with that, as well as getting some graduate students to help increase capacity of on the ground old forest inventory and improving those models. So those efforts are absolutely ongoing. James can speak to when we wanted to take that all a little bit a step further to look at to create these alternatives C and D. We used data, and I'll pull in James to speak more precisely to that, but we used existing metrics that we could pull out additional areas of forest that were closer to showing indications of those late successional attributes.
Yeah, so it doesn't sound like you have much modern research going on. You're still, it's from what you said, it's still, on the ground, measuring metrics and all this stuff. But I think that you guys have to open your eyes to other newer technologies that will help you determine what is and what isn't old growth or near old growth.
So Elaine, I appreciate your comment. I'll just add that, once the executive order was issued, there were, I would say, several researchers across the country that were working to complete this national definition and inventory of mature and old growth forest. And it was a bit of a race. And so that Della Sala paper was one of the first, it was the first one that came out with an attempt to define and map areas of mature and old growth forest. It was just one. There was another one that came out a little bit later. I can't recall the author's names now. But and then the third one I'll just say was our agency's FS 1215A document, which provided some working definitions of mature and old growth forest. Again, at a national level. So that's pretty coarse, right? These are these national inventories that rely on a lot of assumptions. Like the De La Sala one and another one I looked at, biomass or carbon accrual. That's one method, but it doesn't kind of actually get to on the ground measurements, which it's basically taking a measured plot from one point and imputing it out, which again, at a national level, you're going to lose a lot of specificity, right? We use a similar kind of imputation process here because we don't have data from every stand, right? We have data from most of the stands within the project area. But I'll just say, like, we followed these, we looked at them, but we worked with that commenter again to actually set those criteria for what should be late successional forest. And then again, we went out on the ground with Suzanne and one of our other biologists, Meredith, and Bob Zano from the state of Vermont, and actually looked at, like, is this old forest, state designated old forest? And so I don't think you can get much better than actually looking at a stand, to say whether or not it's old forest versus looking at a map at 30-meter resolution across the entire country. So I'll just say that our methods were pretty good, I would say.
Yeah,
We've got-
and I would just add, Elaine, just one thought is that, we're constantly looking and developing new tools, models, ways to capture information accurately. We use LiDAR quite extensively in our work for various things. Forestry being one of them, just one of them. And I would say when it comes to the topic of old growth, the complexity of what defines old growth on the ground, we can use models and things to point us to someplace to look at, but it is really going to take people being on the ground to say, yes, this is meeting the definition of, and whatever definition you're using, this is meeting the definition of old growth at this location. I don't think we can rely on a predictive model to, like, designate that feature on the landscape. It can point us to someplace to look at.
We've got just a few minutes left, but we have one more question in the chat. Thomas, you can unmute your mic.
Am I unmuted?
You
Can
are.
you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can.
Well, I only have about 30 or 40 questions, so I'd better pick the easiest ones first. I read with interest about the native speckled trout, but I do not know, in all of these small streams going into medium-sized streams, are they prevalent in this particular area? Or do they go into small ponds or the reservoir? I haven't seen, I've lived here for 80 years. I haven't seen a speckled trout in the past 20. That was question number one. Are you doing anything, or you mentioned Trout Unlimited earlier? Is there any program that the state of Vermont has in conjunction with your program that could enhance the reproduction and growth of the population of the speckled trout? That's question number one. And number two, in reading all of your information, you mentioned an absence of red oak in the forest. Are there? Am I correct in that? I think that there was a fairly small percentage of oak trees in the area that you're talking about. And I wanted to know if there was any kind of planting program for, I know some of the foresters around my area, I unfortunately have had property completely surrounding me logged off, and I'm hoping that the forester is he said he was going to replant with red oak. And I wanted to know why there were so few red oak in that area. Was it because of animals not moving the nut around, or if they just the pH in the soils was not conducive, or do you have any information on that?
So Thomas, let's see if we can chunk those out a little bit. And I think James can respond to the planting question, and James and Suzanne can respond to the oak question. The speckled trout, which I think you mean, like, you're referring to maybe brook trout,
Yes.
is the trout you're referring to. Yes, they do occur in the streams and likely in some of the higher elevation ponds in the project area. We don't have our fisheries biologist on the call with us tonight, but he'll be here in my office tomorrow morning, and I will certainly ask him that question. If you want to send that question to Jay, we'll get you a very specific answer and then post it on the site. But I know they do occur in the project area.
Okay, thank you. And about the oak trees?
Yeah, Susan, you want me to give that a
Sure.
Okay.
Either
So
way.
Thomas,
go for it.
yeah, the oak as a component of forests is pretty limited in the Telephone Gap project area, but where it's found, I'm trying to remember, it's kind of in like 3 kind of distinct like areas of the project area, and it's probably an artifact of the disturbance history there to an extent. You know, not knowing the disturbance history, but the history of grazing or burning, something allowed oak to become kind of dominant in those little pockets of forest. And it is currently kind of transitioning into more of a mesic, northern hardwood forest. There's nothing in those oak forests to suggest they're regenerating to oak. So as part of the project, there you'll see both kind of mechanical and herbicide treatments to enhance oak habitat and prescribed fire treatments to enhance oak habitat, and those appear on the story map website. You'll see those shapes. And so as a
I saw that, but I didn't understand the process of the burn.
So the idea is that there's a first kind of mechanical treatment to remove the mid-story of those forests to get a little bit more sunlight on the forest floor. Part of that is a chemical component to treat a small amount of those beech trees that were cut to prevent them from sprouting back. And then there's a planting component at that time to establish oak seedlings in that light environment. And then the prescribed fire treatment is a follow-up kind of maintenance. So we would burn those areas on kind of an interval to, again, once those oak seedlings have reached a size where they can tolerate that fire, that would be the way that we would maintain them and allow them to continue to grow and recruit into the overstory.
Okay.
And then there's another part of the climate adaptation tree planting where oak is a component of that as well, and those areas don't necessarily overlap with the oak enhancement treatment. So that was essentially trying to expand the areas where oak is present on the landscape, and that description is in the project as well, but it's a pretty low density planting of these tree species that include oak that are projected to be better adapted to our future climate. And so the idea is not to transition those other areas to oak forest, but to kind of create these pockets of species that are potentially better adapted to future climate that would then hopefully slowly spread out from there as our climate warms towards the mid to late century.
Well, I was also concerned because in reading about the borer and the all of the ash trees, that the 20% of Vermont's forests are ash, and so that I don't see. I've talked to a lot of foresters, some very good ones, and but you're not going to go around in an entire forest of 10,000 acres and hand the herbicide or pesticide that spray whatever you do to eradicate the insect. So I'm concerned about the ash borer. And it seems to me that the replacement tree could very easily be the red oak, because I've seen them survive many different types of environments. And I'm wondering why there wouldn't be some down by the more marshy swamp area. Are there any in that wetland area or the edge of it? That's normally where they would be growing.
Thomas, could you clarify what you're asking? Like, what is near the wet area? What is growing near the wet area?
Yeah, yeah. Are you doing any planting near the wetland area with oak?
No, we don't. We don't have any planting proposed near the. I don't know which wet area you're talking about, but the areas we're proposing to plant are within harvest areas only, and regeneration. Only a subset of those regeneration harvests, and they're kind of in lower elevation, south-facing slopes.
Okay.
But I'll just throw out there one other part about the ash, and this came up at the public meeting as well. There was an earlier project that we put forth on the Green Mountain National Forest to retain intact ash forests on the landscape. And so we're in a subset of more rich ash forests. We're treating, it's like up to 20 some odd individual trees per site with, I think it's imamectin benzoate, the same treatment that you see if you drive around Vermont or New Hampshire right now. Any of the ash trees that have a flag around it that says this tree has been treated to protect it from emerald ash borer. We are doing that same thing in these kind of rich ecological spots to retain ash on the landscape. And there's 2 of those stands in the Telephone Gap project area. So
Okay.
just put that in, but that was a separate project that we did.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
We will take the last question in the chat and then close out. Annette, would you like to unmute your mic?
Muted, Chris.
Annette, I've unmuted your mic on my end. If you want to unmute on your end, you can ask your question.
That mic button is right just to the left of the leave button, Annette, before you get over to the camera button. Annette, do you see the microphone button top right of your screen? There's the camera button with a drop down next to it, and right next to it, it says mic. It's got a slash through it right now. If you click it, the slash will disappear and you'll be unmuted. I tried to do it on this end, and we've done what we can to unmute it, but I think you have to click that button, that mic button, not next to your name, but up top on the banner. Not having any luck. So Annette, we can't hear you if you are talking, and I'm not sure I can give you any more direction on how to unmute that on your end, unmute the mic. If you want to go ahead and yeah, I don't. Oh, she go.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's lowered her hand.
It is like I can activate. I think I can reactivate the chat box for her just so she can get her question in.
Okay,
I can try anyway.
give it a try. And that we're going to try to get that chat, reopen the chat. Maybe you can type your question in. If that doesn't work, why don't you just go ahead and email Jay the question, and we'll get it answered, and then we'll post it back so everybody can see. As Jay is working on that, just in the valuing everyone's time. Oh, there we go. Go ahead, Annette. Why don't you type them in there and we'll. While you're typing them, I'm just going to remind everybody quickly that the closing of the comment period is April 8th at 11:59 p.m. So it has, if you're doing it online, you want to have your comment in by April 8th at 11:59. And then if you're mailing it, it needs to be postmarked by that date. And I will again remind folks and ask that you go ahead and read the document and be sure you're not listening to what someone else is telling you, because I realized as I got done with my presentation, I must have had a moment of dyslexia and like displaced some numbers in some of the acreages that I gave. It's like 8,205 acres in the modified alternative B, not 8,502. So even I can make a mistake. And even though how many times I've read this document, how familiar I am with it, you can make a mistake when you're trying to tell somebody about it. So make sure you read it for yourselves before you provide your comments to us.
So Chris, I can, there's our last question. So the first question is, no, there's not a glossary to the environmental assessment itself. There's a glossary at the end of the forest plan where a lot of the terminology that may be not so familiar to a lot of folks can be defined. It's at the back end of the forest plan, which is also available online on our project website, not on our project website, but on the Green Mountain National Forest website. You can navigate directly to our existing forest plan and find the glossary there. And that, if you can't find the definition for any terminology that may be confusing to you in the glossary of the forest plan, just email me and I would be happy to clarify anything that you may have a question about. Sorry about that. It's hard to take a lot of scientific information and distill it down to totally understandable terminology. And I think the Forest Service may be pretty bad about using jargon freely, thinking that other people understand what that means. So I apologize. The second question is, you downloaded the documents, I'm assuming off our website. Can you confirm there are 24 different documents? I can't confirm that right off the top of my head without actually going to the website and counting them myself. But if you're counting 24 there, that's how many there are. I highlighted them in my presentation. You know, the primary documents, the EA, the appendices, there's 7 different maps right there. We're getting close to 10 documents. In the supporting documents, I believe there's at least 6 or 7 documents there. And I just added some other supporting information specific to the categorization of late successional forest stands. that are allocated to the different categories with the different focus of treatments, including the deferred harvests of no treatments. Those are in there as well. So there's probably like 6 or 7 additional documents plus a map there. I don't know if that adds up to 24, but should. I'll double check for you when I get offline here and I can send you an email. Make sure you got everything that you need. If you feel like you're missing something, just let me know. And your last question, the deadline. I previously requested an extension as a deadline is only 10 days away and there's a very large amount of material to digest. It would result in a far better comments if there's more time, even 2 weeks. Chris?
Yeah, no, I've answered that question for you before, Annette, and I answered it for someone else today, is that no, we're sticking with the 30-day comment period, which will close on April 8th. Really, the new information relates to primarily the forest habitat, forest health, and the carbon sections. None of the other resource areas had significant changes in them. And I feel like there's adequate time, even with, if you haven't even picked up the document until today, there should be adequate time for you to be able to read through, digest, and provide us meaningful comments on the project and the alternatives being displayed. So thank you for the request, but we're sticking to the 30-day comment period. And so with that, I think we've reached the end of tonight's presentation. Again, I thank you all for joining. I apologize about the weather last week causing a little hiccup in some folks' plans to attend live and in person. And we are available to answer any other questions that you might have. If you want to send them to Jay or myself, we'll get them to the right people to get answers. And we will get an answer to Thomas on that one brook trout question with a little more specificity from Jeremy Mears, our fish biologist. And with that, everybody had a good evening.
Yeah, Chris, just to follow up really quick, because I can't respond to Annette's text chat. The glossary definitions in the forest plan have not changed. There have been updates made to it in the last 3 or 4 years. They're all in there, the updates. So you'll have the latest and greatest there. And I will follow up with you to make sure that you're getting all the documents you need off the website.
All right. That is Jay?
Yes.
All right. Everybody have a safe trip home. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.